Dr. Beccalossi comes to us from Oxford Brookes University, where she teaches a number of interesting classes, including Brave New Worlds, Medicine and Modernity, 1850 to 2000, and Engineering Society, Eugenics and Biopolitics in Europe, 1860 to 1945. Her first book, Female Sexual Inversion, Same-Sex Desires in Italian and British Sexology, 1870 to 1920, was recently published by MacMillan. It offers fresh perspectives on how female same-sex desires were constructed and treated by doctors and researchers in several different countries and across medical specialties such as psychiatry, psychology, criminal anthropology, forensic medicine, and gynecology. She's also embarked on 2 exciting new research projects. The first explores British sexual tourism in Italy during the 19th century among men looking for sexual encounters with women, such as courtesans and prostitutes, or with men. Her second project explores how a network of sex researchers defined sexual norms and treated sexual deviances and dysfunctions across Europe in the interwar period, with a special focus on Italian Jews. She's co-edited Cultural History of Sexuality in the Age of Empire and published a number of articles and book chapters. I'd also like to introduce our 2 respondents today, Kurt MacMillan and Doug Haynes. Dr. MacMillan received his doctorate in history from the University of California at Irvine last December. His dissertation is entitled Hormonal Bodies, Sex, Race, and Constitutional Medicine in the Iberian American World, 1900 to 1950. Dr. MacMillan has carried out research in Spain, Ecuador, and Chile, and made presentations on such diverse subjects as transnational biotypology, the classification of indigenous peoples, Chilean body hair studies in the 1930s and 40s, and hormonal discourses about sex types. Next year, Dr. MacMillan will be a Humanities Research Associate at UC Irvine. He also strongly anticipates lecturing in the Ethnic and Women's Studies Department at the California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, as well as the Departments of Women's Studies at the University of California, Riverside, and California State University at Fullerton. Our Doug Haynes may need no introduction, but I will give him one in any case. One of the organizers of this institute, Dr. Haynes is an alum of the University of Pennsylvania, at least for his PhD. He is professor of history here at Dartmouth, where it appears, if I read this correctly on his CV, that he will be celebrating his 3rd decade on campus this fall.
When the fall, the beginning of the fourth.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
4. My goodness. Among the fascinating courses he's offered are Senior Seminar on Mao and Gandhi, and he's published 2 monographs, Rhetoric and Ritual in Colonial India, The Shaping of Public Culture in Surat City, 1852 to 1928, in 1991, and 2012's Small Town Capitalism in Western India, Artisans, Merchants, and the Making of the Informal Economy, 1870 to 1960. For this book, he was awarded the 2013 John F. Richards Prize from the American Historical Association for the most distinguished work of scholarship on South Asian history published in English during the previous year. He has co-edited 2 other volumes, published dozens of journal articles, essays, and reviews. And I'd like us to welcome our presenter in response today with a round of applause. So to get started, we are asking Dr. Beccalossi, Chiara, to begin with maybe 10 minutes of discussion. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank Douglas and Veronica for inviting me here and for organizing this wonderful and very stimulating institute. I'm going to give a very formal introduction, as I was asked, and I will first talk about my transnational approach to the history of sexology and how this specific paper that you have read fits into thinking about the history of sexology. And at the very end of this brief introduction, I will expose the questions that I'm trying to answer in this paper. Now, my interest in the transnational history of sexology began some years ago when I started my PhD. I was interested in how different countries in Europe developed sexology at the end of the 19th century. Initially, I focused on Britain and Italy. I published a monograph on this, and then I broadened my research to France and Germany. Now, one of the challenges of transnational history is to provide a detailed historical narrative. Indeed, transnational historians are quite often criticized for not using primary sources enough or for providing too many generalizations. So, in order to avoid this risk, I had to limit the scope of my research. And to date, I've mainly focused on how sexology constructed and treated female homosexuality, and I've also limited my research to medical trained sexologists. On Monday and last week, we mentioned sexologists like Edward Carpenter. While I recognize the importance of these intellectuals within the history of sexology, for practical reason, I only focus on medical trained sexologists. And also in my work on eugenics, I want to focus on medically trained eugenicists. In my work, I've also looked at how national histories influenced sexology. So, for example, in my work on Italian sexology, it was important to me to look at how the context of the Italian unification in 1861 influenced the development of Italian sexology, and how my Italian sexologists contributed to a number of changes, of cultural changes at the end of the 19th century, including the process of secularization. So in my new project on the interwar period, it's important for me to look at the role of fascist regime in promoting eugenics, sexology, how these sexologists were part of the fascist regime, in what kind of organization they worked. So, while I study the history of medicine, to me it's very important to locate this history of medicine within a specific national history. A final point on my approach to transnational history is that the meaning and methods of transnational history are still very controversial. Especially political historians in Europe speak about so many different approaches to the history to the transnational history. They are talking about entangled history, transfer history, history cruise, and many other approaches. To me, transnational history is just an umbrella concept, and what I'm really interested in is how scientific knowledge and sexual knowledge moved across countries. How does this specific paper fit into thinking about the history of sexology? Well, last week and on Monday, my impression was that we are trying to draw parallels between countries. We are looking at similarities a lot, which is very important. But in my work, I also want to pay attention at differences. If we look at the interwar period, and we look at eugenics, for example, there was no such a thing like a monolithic Europe. Europe was not a single entity. And I think that eugenics makes that very clear, because we have a clear division between an Anglo-Saxon model of eugenics, Germany, England, and so on, and what is called a Latin model of eugenics, France, Spain, and Italy. And I'm interested in Latin eugenics. I'm interested in particular in this guy, Nicola Pende, who developed amazing connections in Europe and across the world. He was supported financially and politically by Mussolini. And the more I studied this guy, I discovered that he invested a lot of energy in Latin America. So I'm planning to develop my project in that direction to Latin America. I'm not a Latin Americanist, first of all. I'm very glad that there are proper Latin Americanists here, Kurt, Ryan and Pablo, and I've already learned a lot from them, and I'm sure that I will continue to learn from them. I'm really keen to hear your feedback and comments. Finally, very briefly, my questions. Well, my questions are listed actually in my conclusion. I hope to be able to answer all these questions. I have mainly 4 questions. One is the role of criminal anthropology and Cesare Lombroso in Pende's biotypology, and also in his ability to establish connections across the Atlantic. My general impression is that Italian criminal anthropology laid the foundation for Pende's transatlantic connections. I would like to move away from the view that Argentina was a passive recipient of Italian eugenics. This view has been promoted and somehow encouraged by Nancy Stefan. To me, in Argentina, we can see, for example, like they applied sterilization, they approved the premarital certificates. We don't have anything like that in Italy. So Argentina was not a passive recipient. They were Argentinian eugenicists were very eclectic, and they developed further. I would like to explore more this mutual relationship between Italian and Argentinian eugenics. I'm really interested in understanding why Italian eugenicists like Pende invested so much time and energy in Latin America. And of course, I would like to understand more the role of fascism in promoting sexual knowledge and eugenics. Now, the paper needs much editing. While I was reading the paper yesterday, I realized that there are a number of typos. I started a couple of sentences without finishing them. I find it particularly challenging to cover 3 countries in a single paper, considering the word limit. My initial idea was to talk more about homosexuality and to use more the Argentinian eugenic journal analysis, because Marañón, Pende wrote on this journal, but as my paper progressed, I realized that I didn't have enough time, and I hope that I will be able to develop more my paper, but I'm keen to hear your comments first, and then I will decide what to do with my paper.
My comments, I have to write them out in prose form eventually. I had so many that I just had to sort of group them together into an essay form. I have some general remarks, and then I have some really specific, more historiographical interventions in kind of letting some of the regional specialists in Latin America and Spain sort of talk back to your paper through me. So I will try to do all of that. So in The Making of Sexual Norms, Latin Eugenics Across the Atlantic, 1919 through 1946, Chiara Beccalossi explores how sexology and eugenics became intertwined during the interwar period in Italy, Spain, and Argentina. And Beccalossi posits a transnational scientific network tied to particular nation-building projects in these regions. She usefully borrows Dagmar Herzog's term of sexuality management to characterize the mutual imbrication of sexologists and eugenicists in the production of true knowledge of sex and its regulation. She carefully maps the circulation of sexological and eugenic knowledges across this region by focusing on key scientific figures such as Nicola Pende, Cesare Lombroso, and Gregorio Marañón, to show how a network of medical men interested in eugenics put sexual behavior and reproduction at the center of their research. And she traces this by looking at specific sites of transnational connection, including international congresses and conferences, the formation of biotypological institutions, and the circulation of ideas internationally through nationally based medical journals. She also examines discussions of eugenics, sexology, and homosexuality that cut across many disciplines, and these disciplines, the boundaries are quite porous. They include criminal anthropology, sexology, eugenics, endocrinology, and biotypology. And while doing all of this, she also remains sensitive to the flows of knowledge and expertise across these networks that was not simply a one-way diffusion from Italy. Beccalossi also refines the connection between sexology and eugenics by focusing on the discursive formation of the homosexual as an object of scientific study and a target of medically informed nation building. And here, the shadow of fascism looms large, particularly in Mussolini's Italy, but also Argentina. There's some allusions to Nazi Germany and Francoist Spain. And in thinking about the idea of Latin eugenics, I think that is a term that bears some reflection and unpacking. And I see Latin eugenics as having a couple of major themes that I'd like to flesh out here. First, as a neo-Lamarckian phenomenon, and this is building on the work of Nancy Stepan on eugenics in Latin America, where she compares Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. And the connection here is that there's a pushback in Latin America against biological determinism and notions of physically embodied deviance. And constitutionalism and biotypology are always in dialogue with environmental influences. There's never, it's just the hormones or just the glands. There's always this connection with environment. And Pende wrote in a book that was translated into English and published with scholars at Columbia University who had a constitution clinic in the 1920s. In this text called Constitutional Inadequacies, Pende wrote, quote, of the importance of curing the soil. And so Pende's work supports social hygiene efforts and the idea that constitutional predispositions can be aggravated by external influences. Whereas if someone with a particular predisposition is put in the right environment, that constitutional predisposition might never be expressed or remain benign. And so for Pende, he's interested in, when it comes to curing the soil, targets are sexual promiscuity, alcohol, tobacco, the need for sanitary living conditions, the possibility, although maybe not in practice, of preventative eugenics around marriages, and creating typologies of parents to make sure that the right people are getting married and procreating. And then also the possibility of organotherapy, which was tied to notions of rejuvenation, and that you could prolong youth by administering hormonal extracts. So there's the neo-Lamarckian dimension of Latin eugenics. It's also, I think of the Latinness of it as a response to notions of race and degeneration from Northern and Western Europe. And Nancy Stepan has pointed out how ideas of degeneration that are formed in Northern and Western Europe are very much tied to a Latin American other. And that you can see north-south dichotomies across lots of this eugenic literature from Europe. First of all, the location of Italy and Spain as part of a European South. Then looking towards the Americas, North America versus South America as being inverted images of one another. And then also with Lombroso, Northern Italy versus Southern Italy. Charles Hale has pointed out the role of north-south dichotomies in the work of the French scientist Gustave Le Bon, who's famous for theorizing crowd behavior and also tied to fascism. Le Bon contrasted the stability of the North, which he associated with progress and stability, to a Latin South, which seemed to include both Southern Europe and Latin America, which was considered to be racially decadent and degenerate. So one question here is the awareness of Latin eugenicists of the fact that their nations are being positioned as racially other to Northern European claims of racial superiority. And so how are they dealing and negotiating these racial politics in their works? Also, Lombroso, his notion of born criminality was tied to racialized definitions of criminal populations. And he saw criminal anthropology as being specifically tied to Italian nation building and unification and the colonization of southern Italy. In his work, Criminal Man, he points to southern Italy as being inhabited by Sicilians, who are the descendants of Arab conquerors. And he also highlights Bedouins and Gypsies as, quote, races of organized criminals, which he compares to Negroes in the United States, Albanians, and Greeks. At the same time, I would also point out that in Spain and Argentina and also in Latin America, the sort of Latin South also has its own internal racial hierarchies, not just the North versus South. There's the North versus South, but then there's also the internal question. And so here's a kind of nice formulation of where Pende fits into some of this from Nancy Stepan. She says, quote, Pende's goal was to use his science to identify and measure the 6 fundamental constitutional types that he believed made up all human populations. And just as a side note, in my research, I see Pende's influence, not necessarily his entire political project, but just his categories are what people are interested in, his taxonomies, his terminologies. To continue with Stepan, although the biotypes did not exactly overlap with races, there was an easy slippage from the language of the type to the language of race. Individuals were assigned to their type by detailed anatomical and physiological analysis, in which endocrinology played a large part. While the basic features of the type were believed to follow Mendelian patterns of inheritance, each individual's heredity was also presumed to be open to degenerative environmental factors. So it's kind of the doubleness of the environmental factor. Also, eugenic regulation and improvement of the biotypes of the nation were believed to be possible through the control of, quote, blastophoric influences, which included alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and venereal disease. The historian of medicine, Alexandra Stern, has looked at biotypology in Mexico in the 1940s and 1950s, and she points out the way that Mexican biotypologists used the work of Pende and others as a means of classifying indigenous groups that avoided ideas of race and racial categories premised on white European superiority. And that biotypology would impose a new social order that privileged heredity without abandoning external factors. And so in this case, it's the neo-Lamarckian approach to eugenics as a nationalistic and regional response to racial ideologies of Northern and Western Europe that positioned the South as always already degenerate. And then the third area in thinking about Latin eugenics as a race-based claim of transnational, cultural, and political alliance during the World War II era. So in my own research, I've seen Italian physicians who immigrate to Chile and in the 1940s are writing about Latin unity as it's kind of a cozying up to Mussolini and saying that there's this like Southern identity that we are all a part of. And then one thing that you allude to in your paper, which I'd love to hear more about, is Pende's notion of a Mussolinian University of Latin and Mediterranean culture. And so the question here is, what imaginaries of a Latin world were at work during this period? And what are the affinities seen between Italy and Argentina, but also Argentina and Spain? Where does Spain fit into this picture? Following the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, with the sort of death knell of Spanish Empire, there is ideological movements and cultural movements to connect a certain affinity between Spain and its former colonies back and forth. This is traced in Frederick Pike's book on Hispanismo, and this is another kind of transnational ideology that is both cultural and political. And another important work that I think should be brought into dialogue here is also Joshua Good's recent book called Impurity of Blood, which is about race and anthropology in Spain from 1870 to 1930. And he actually goes in a slightly different direction from the focus on Lombroso here, because he actually says that, at least when it came to Lombroso's notion of atavism, the idea that certain people are throwbacks to an earlier time period, he said that Spanish criminologists weren't interested in buying into Lombroso's notion of atavism, and that the project was about racial fusion in the late 19th century up to, say, the Franco period. And he writes, quote, "Instead, Spanish criminologists came to see criminal behavior as the product of missteps, breaks, or derailments in the process of the proper racial fusion that characterized the non-criminal Spanish population. The criminal anthropologists presented a liberal and nationalist view of Spain that they saw as congenitally in need of national unity and requiring scientific means of controlling crime and suppressing working-class political agitation. And finally, the larger goal was to promote an organic evolutionary image of a unified Spanish populace devoid of regional separatist inclinations and revolutionary working-class politics." And then moving on from the kind of big unpacking of Latin eugenics, I'd also like to focus a little bit of attention on the homosexual and Marignon, because that's sort of a pet project for me. I think one question that is raised by your analysis in looking at Lombroso and his influence over the sexologists is there a parallel shift around maybe ideas of sexual acts, sodomy, to the idea of the homosexual as a biological species? Because it would seem that for Lombroso, the homosexual is someone who is biologically determined and has no free will, so they cannot be punished for their acts, per se. So there's this whole like revision in legality there. And I'd also like to highlight how Marignon's position is complicated, and I think you're pointing out some of that tension in Marignon's work. And so if I can maybe try to help clarify it as much as I've been able to do so far. Marignon sees homosexuality as both congenital and acquired at the same time. He sees it as being both tied to constitution and environment. And he also opens the possibility of circumstantial homosexuality tied to environment, which could be alcohol, drugs, or deprivation of women. And he's sympathetic but unconvinced by hormone therapies for curing homosexuality. And here his investment in Freudian psychoanalysis is really key. In his theory of intersexuality, he talks about how hormonal problems can set the stage for homosexuality, but the hormones are not everything. And here he talks about object choice and childhood development. And he focuses, for men in particular, on puberty as this period of sexual crisis where you move out of latency and a kind of sexually ambiguous, both physically and mental position prior to puberty, and that it's during puberty that you have the emergence of both a sex body and a sexual object choice. And so in that sense, he sees object choice as being driven by libido and environment. And in that sense, he sees education and environment mattering to the development of homosexuality. And his prescription is follow your gender role really closely. Don't deviate from it. He is suspicious of overbearing mothers. He's suspicious of boarding schools where anything can happen. And even though there's this kind of appeal to the idea that there's a kind of bisexual potentiality in the development of the glands during the embryonic phase, it doesn't sort of produce a kind of, so we have this fluid spectrum and we should just accept it. It's more, so because there's this danger, we have to like reinforce the polarity of gender. And then he's also, I just want to bring this in because I think it's really great. the idea that a homosexual has a kind of legible body and that there's a marked body, just as the criminal is a marked body for Lombroso, that the homosexual is a marked body. And he's a little ambivalent about it. He brings in both Freud and Hirschfeld. He brings in a quote from Freud saying, quote, "I cannot on any terms agree that homosexuals constitute a group with characteristics different from those of other individuals." And then he contrasts this to Hirschfeld, who says, "Out of 1,500 homosexuals, I have not found a single one whom I could not distinguish physically or morally from a normal person." So Hirschfeld says, my gaydar is really accurate. And then Marignan leads to this position, well, there is the possibility that one could be a homosexual with no physical sign. He says, though, that there's at least 2/3 of homosexual men with some physical sign of intersexuality. And so maybe to pull some of this together, I see race and masculinity as big categories that are important to your project, and particularly around the status of nation building, but then also the larger relationships and geopolitical connections that are going on between this kind of global south around the Latin eugenics. So I'll leave it there.
I guess my comments are very different, not surprisingly, since I know nothing about this subject until I read this. I wanted to talk more about the implications for global history. I'm very sorry Sanjum wasn't able to be here, because I think she would be the best commentator, because she's worked on these kinds of global networks connected to the Journal of Marriage Hygiene and the International Journal of Sexology. But as I said earlier, it seems to me that Pablo's paper and your paper are really the most global in scope. Most of us are rooted in one particular society, even if we're kept looking out to how things are coming from outside and being transformed, and so on. And it seemed to me that you developed a very sophisticated appreciation of the international character of sexuality, tracing its transformation from the second half of the 19th century in Europe and North America, where concerns about sexual inversion were central, to a later phase where it seems to me a more diverse set of concerns were developed and new kinds of networks emerge. Now, it struck me that the term Latin eugenics was a very useful term, and it's one that may have implications for everyone in the room in a way, to thinking about the notion of circuits of people who are operating in particularly intense ways. So you're talking about Spanish and Italian speakers crossing the Atlantic, participating in a global sexual science. But if we think of global sexual science, then we might think of a number of these circles with embracing different parts of the world. And it struck me as we have the Latin eugenics, and then we have a circle that maybe includes people like Marie Stopes and Van de Velde, and people who are concerned about what the proper, how to maximize the happiness of marriages and the sexual behaviors involved there, and on notions of sex education. And then you have the birth control activists like Margaret Sanger and Stopes and others who are going out to Japan and India and finding people there. And so that we might think of the global sexology not as sort of one sort of unified field, but a number of these circles that do overlap at times at international conferences and so on, where they interact. But these circuits are circuits of particularly intense social interaction and intellectual interaction, and they're circuits that define particular sets of problems as the crucial ones for sexology to be being addressed. And so they're very different, it seems to me, in different contexts. And it seems to me what struck me that was very distinctive here from the sexologies I know about is the notion of developing scientific techniques to correct so-called abnormal behaviors and so on. It just, you know, the people I look at just aren't involved in that sort of thing. Endocrinology and so on. It's just beyond what I'm familiar with in the literature that I'm looking at. So it may be that if I went back to the journals, like Marriage Hygiene and International Journal of Sexology, I'd find that there are articles scattered in there, but I don't know that to be the case. I don't think that's the case. Now, methodologically, it seems to me that you identified a number of useful modes of interaction that we can use to characterize global circuits that are more generalizable beyond this particular case. That on one hand, you're talking about travel and patterns of interaction. You talk about interaction at universities, you know, where students come and get trained by particular scholars. Journals where work by specialists from different locales can be published. International congresses, self-referencing in footnotes, so people are drawing upon each other and referencing to each other. Book reviews of each other's works. Translations from one language to another, and modes of scholarly recognition and reward allocating mechanisms like status attribution, perhaps prizes and promotions. They weren't, those prizes didn't figure in, I don't think, in your paper. But so I see these modes of interaction as being more generally applicable to studies across the board. And it's through these modes of interaction, it seems, that scientists come to define certain types of scientific problems as the dominant ones that need to be addressed, and identify certain intellectual paradigms and approaches as the relevant ones to respond to, even if they're transforming those agendas in different ways at different times. So I think it's a really, to go beyond just the actual material in the paper, I think you're presenting a model that allows us to move from the modes of interaction to the actual intellectual output that's emerging. Another point, this is a kind of very different point, but it comes back to something that came up in the discussion last time, is this intellectual interaction is going on in all directions. It's crossing the Atlantic both ways. There's no easy metropole and periphery in this model. There's kind of no Europe and periphery that we in the South Asian context or other colonial contexts are used to using. And one way of thinking of this is to come back to Ryan's comments. I wish I could remember exactly how you put this, but does it kind of metropole Europe, metropole periphery thing really work in the Europe, Latin American interaction patterns? Is Argentina just as much a part of Europe as Spain or Italy are in this kind of sense? But I do think there's a contrast to the areas that I'm working on, because it seems to me that the people we're looking at appropriate ideas from Europe, but it's very hard to see Europeans appropriating their ideas in return. And this, and what's the reason for that? Is it something to do with colonial power, imperial power? Certainly, there's an issue of the dominant languages of scholarly interaction. You're talking about a circuit in which people are learning each other's languages. Spanish speakers are learning Italian. Italian speakers are learning Spanish, but English speakers aren't learning Marathi. They're not learning Chinese. They're not learning Japanese. So those Japanese sexologists really, it doesn't seem like their ideas are moving back to Europe and influencing sexology there. So the nature of power relationships within these circuits seems to be very, very different. Okay, now to kind of make a transition, I have a couple of suggestions which are really around the fringes of your project and have more to do with the setting of the project, and particularly as an outsider, things that struck me. One is, it'd be interesting to know more about the historiographical context in which your work figures. And really what I'm getting at is, how does a global approach make us rethink previous approaches, say, to the issue of eugenics? I would not be at all surprised if eugenics historically is being considered very much in national context rather than in this kind of international context. So, what kind of difference does that make? I'd also be not at all surprised if Italian eugenics, and this is just a hypothesis, is often seen in juxtaposition to Nazi eugenics, and that there's discussion of influences there, but you're suggesting that Italian eugenics need to be understood in a kind of different social world, but I'm not sure if that's the case. A related issue is, are there some larger stakes involved in this reinterpretation? For instance, does this help us gain insights into significant differences between Italian policy, eugenics policy during the late 20s and 30s, and Nazi policy that we haven't understood before, because we're looking at these international approaches. So, in both by making both of these points, I'm suggesting that maybe framing things a little more ambitiously would allow you to make bigger claims for the significance of your research without actually transforming any of the heart of the material. And I'm just talking, I'm not talking about more than a page or two in this. Another point that struck me as I moved through this, a very different point, has to do with the disciplinarity of the figures that you're talking about. And Kurt mentioned this, but early on in the paper, you open up by seeking to distinguish eugenics from science in general and sexual science in particular, and you talk about how they are intertwined. But it seemed as the paper went along, those distinctions between disciplines I didn't quite see and as clearly. And it does seem to me that there's eugenics, there's criminal anthropology, endocrinology. Are they just unified fields, or are they fields that are in interaction in some way? And this kind of comes back to a question that was posed in our introductory session about what actually is sexual science? What are the boundaries of sexual science? Is it just a set of core people who are looking at issues of sexology in a very direct way, like Hirschfeld, Ellis, and so on? Or are we talking, when we talk about sexual science, are we talking about the way different disciplines take up ideas that are coming from sexual science? If we're talking about global sexual science, is it important to not just study the field of sexual science more narrowly, but to look at the way in which its understandings are penetrating these other disciplines? And it seemed to me you were mentioning how your work also looked at popular understandings, how sexual science transformed in popular understanding, and you alluded to state policy as well. So that this is suggesting a much more ambitious and broader agenda if we're looking at those issues as well as the narrow set of sexual scientists. Another thing that might be drawn out is the issues of change over time. You, as I understood it, you seem to suggest there's a period in which these Latin circuits are emerging from another kind of international sexological kind of networking. Could you draw those out? So there are things at the beginning of your period, I think, that would be very interesting to talk about in terms of, why does this change from an earlier period to another, and how does it change? And then at the end of the period, I guess the question that occurred to me is, do the more intense needs of national states in the late 30s kind of lead to the dissolution of the Latin circuit, or did the Latin circuit actually survive World War II and get perpetuated after that time? So is some kind of new structure, international structure, developed? So overall, I felt this was a really rich paper that really fits well within the scope of the larger institute, and my comments are really an attempt to suggest some broader questions that are suggested, I think, by your material, and would allow you to draw more attention to your work. So, but I think that all of that to me seemed like a lot of comments, but I'm actually thinking about I'm actually thinking about this all being on the fringe of your paper, and the way you set up your introduction, and perhaps where you come to it in the conclusion. And I think the comment that's really in the middle is this comment about disciplines, because that's where I felt a little less clear.